Welcome to the Sound on Sound recording and mixing podcast channel. My name is Mark Mynett, and in this episode I'm going to be looking at the time-honoured challenge of recording drums, the foundation of the vast majority of modern music. Perhaps stating the obvious, but recording drums, it's not about recording one instrument, it's about recording multiple different instruments: kick, snare, hats, 3 racks and a floor, small little splash cymbal, china, crash ride crash, etc. And taken collectively, all of those components almost cover the entire range of human hearing from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. That's just one of the challenges. We'll discuss some of the other notable challenges along the way. But let's move quickly onwards. Let's start with a quick drum roll. Just a couple of 101s before we get into the microphone selection and placement scenario. Firstly, enter the studio with the drums already reheaded, bedded in, tuned and dampened if need be. You can also drop them off the day before you're recording to get them acclimatized to the studio environment, something that does actually make a difference. Another consideration that you can make that can really improve the drum sound is increasing the separation between your metalwork and your shell pack. And the way to do that is very simply just to get your drummer, for him or her, to practice with their cymbals raised as far above the toms as comfortable. Obviously they don't want to make it uncomfortable, as far as comfortable for them, and that will really help with the separation between the cymbals and your toms and your snare. Before setting up the drums in the live space, firstly establish a desirable location from the perspective of the room's acoustics. You can walk around the room simply hitting a snare drum or a floor and just listen to the general way that the room accentuates or attenuates certain frequency components of the drums. Does it sound? And basically what you're looking for is just a nice, bright, controlled sound. And after finding this constructive location, place the snare drum here and set the drum kit up around it. It's unlikely to be the dead center of the room, is a broad principle that you can operate on here. A really beneficial approach is to just simply set up a space pair of overhead mics, roughly 2 to 2.5 feet, sort of 60 to 75 centimeters above the cymbals, kind of around the hats and the ride side of the kit. And then just monitor the resulting signals in the control room while the drummer plays beats from the ensuing project, and that will really allow you to analyze how the drums translate to the recording environment, to the acoustics of the studio, and it'll also give you a very good idea about which drums need retuning, and that should inform the tuning process. And then once you've got that kit sounding well from the overhead's perspective, then you can start up your miking process. So let's dive straight into the kick drum. Interestingly, it's the one component of the drum kit that is hit in the same place with every single hit. And the result of this is a significant amount of dynamic stability, which means it's the easiest and simplest to use drum samples for, to use a kick sample for. But nevertheless, recording high quality kick sounds is just good basic recording practice, and it's important to your reputation should someone access your session files in the future. It also allows drummers to feel that their sounds and performances have been properly captured and provides a stronger, more inspiring foundation for tracking overdubs. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at 3 separate kick mic placements which can be selected, adapted or combined according to the sound required, and obviously due to the mic pre and microphone availability. But the 3 placements are an attack mic, which is primarily focused on capturing the transient based high frequency energy of the kick drum, a porthole mic placement, which is a relatively balanced perspective of a kick drum's frequency content, and a low frequency capture mic. The attack mic position is obviously likely to be more beneficial for faster double kick performances to make sure you get that articulation and the attack, the click, as most drummers refer to it. The slower the kick subdivisions, the more prioritized the porthole or even the low frequency capture microphone should be, because obviously with those slower performances you've got more space for the low frequencies of the kick drum to expire within. However, by combining these placements, firstly more of the complexity of the kick drum is captured, and secondly you get more control at the mix stage. You can represent different performance speeds by just adjusting the contribution from the microphones. It can be a really powerful approach. Let's move on to the attack mic, which, as I've mentioned, is more suited to faster subdivisions for what drummers usually refer to as click. And the place of the kick drum that we're looking to really capitalize on is the batter head contact point, where the beater strikes the batter head. Avoid trying to mic up the kick drum from the drummer's side, in other words, externally to the kick drum. It's very few rules in recording, but this is one that I'd say is as close as they come, because you get lots of spill from the snare wires. You capture the sound of the drummer's feet on their pedals, squeaks, and you don't also get the compression of air that you get within the kick drum. So go for an internal mic placement. Keep the microphone a minimum of about sort of 5 inches. I would experiment between 5 to 8 inches. That's roughly 12 to 20 centimeters away from the batter head. Take time to experiment whether it sounds better aiming at the batter head contact point or directly at the batter, but avoid that dead zone in the center of the kick drum. A potential alternative option is when you have got the porthole of the kick drum already obstructed by a microphone and you're having problems with boom arm access through the kick drum. Here you can use a low profile design condenser mic that doesn't need a sound, so the Sennheiser E901 or the Shure Beta 91 being 2 examples of these low profile design microphones. You can place these microphones on top of the dampening material, you know, the rug or the duvet inside the kick drum. But if time is available, secure strong corrugated card across the kick drum, so it's roughly 1/4 of the drum's height, and mount the flat profile design microphone on there and then secure it in place with gaffer tape. Let's just briefly have a listen to an attack mic. This is an MD421. It's 8 inches from the batter head, and it's actually aimed directly at the batter head contact point. Sounds like this. Now if we move that microphone closer to the batter head, you'll hear that there's a sort of a splattered impact on the transient creeping in. This is at 5 inches from the batter head. And it becomes even more accentuated if you move that microphone 3 inches from the batter head. You'll hear the transient sounds really splattered now. The half in, half out of the porthole mic placement is the most common way to mic a bass drum, mainly because this position provides a strong balance between warmth and beater presence. Also, when using a wide diaphragm microphone such as an AKG D112 or the Shure Beta 52, Sennheiser E602 or Audix D6, with the placement that the microphone is, it's effectively shielded from seeing a lot of the other drum components by the drum shell itself, so you get a really good spill ratio. Obviously this microphone placement can be improved by blending it with the attack mic and or the low frequency capture mic, but firstly let's have a listen to, this is a D6, an Audix D6 in the half in, half out of the porthole mic placement. Both the attack mic and the porthole mic are both able to sort of see, if you will, the kick batter head, whilst being less influenced by the kick resonator head due to this being to the rear or the sides of the microphone. In contrast, an external kick mic placement not only takes full advantage of the tonal warmth generated by the resonator head, but it also capitalizes on the more abundant low frequency energy at this position, which is more fully developed than within the shell. This means that even with the resonator head removed, something you might want to consider if you want a drier kick sound, not as much resonance, obviously without the res head. You get less resonance. If you want a drier, more controlled kick sound, it actually can be surprisingly effective. But even with the resonator head removed, this placement of just outside the shell does capture more abundant low frequency energy. To more effectively capture this low frequency energy, a microphone with a large diaphragm design is required. As well as mics appropriate for the porthole placement, the ones we've discussed so far, such as the AKG D112, Beta 52, the Electro Voice RE20 can be effective, as can large diaphragm condenser tube condensers, which should be set to cardioid to minimise ambience. So let's have a listen to a low frequency capture microphone on a kick drum. This is a Neumann M147, which is a valve condenser microphone. And then let's combine the low frequency capture mic with a porthole placement, which in this instance is an Audix D6. And then let's add an attack mic, a Sennheiser E901, to both the low frequency capture placement and the porthole placement. Let's move on to the snare drum. The snare drum unquestionably represents the tonal identity of the drummer. You think about all your favourite drummers and there's a good chance that they'll have their own tonal identity that's a lot about their snare tuning. Drum tuning really is a subject for another podcast, but somebody once said there's as many ways to tune a drum kit as there are drummers, and that's the next challenge with drums. Is if you're a guitarist or a bassist, you've got one machine head, one adhered to pitch, and you've got a tuning device. With drums, you've got between 6 to 10 tuning lugs, and that's just on the top head. You then got 6 to 10 tuning lugs on the bottom head. And to get that pleasing pitch bend, generally you don't want them the same. So I'm not going to go too much onto drum tuning because that's a separate subject. But this is where your tonal identity of your drummer really comes in, with the way that he or she tunes the snare drum. Access for the snare top microphone is usually between the smallest tom and the hi-hat. And what you want to do is try and position the microphone so it's roughly halfway between two lugs. Don't have the microphone directly above a lug where unwanted overtones often radiate. And importantly, human hearing is very sensitive to the 2K to 5 kilohertz frequency regions where the hats have really dominant frequency content. And because high frequency amplification and compression are both generally required to get the snare to cut through this dense wall of sound, because you think about it, the drums are impulse-based, sort of short spikes, and then they quickly decay, and they're acoustic. So acoustic impulse-based instruments, on top of which we place sustain-based electric instruments. The drums punching through that is a particular challenge. But because of this high frequency content and compression that you need from the snare drum, it often emphasizes the hat spill. So it's a really good idea to minimize as much hat spill as possible. And going back to one of the 101s I mentioned, one of the most important ones is get the drummer to lift their hats as far above the snare as possible, as comfortable, and that'll really make some important differences. It's also down to the drummer's performance technique. This is one area where truly great drummers are separated from the merely good, is that they will hit their shells a lot harder than their metalwork, and they balance their drum kit through performance. Really important. But moving on to microphone placement and position. Good starting point is an inch over the snare drum and an inch above the snare drum is a good starting position. You can obviously improve on this on multiple ways. And one of the first considerations is proximity. If you're recording for perhaps quite a shallow piccolo snare drum, you might want to reduce that inch to ½ inch just to get more low frequency weight. Or indeed, if you're wanting less of the low frequency weight out of the snare drum, you can raise the microphone up just to reduce that low frequency content. I probably wouldn't go raising that microphone up any more than about 2 inches though, or you're going to sort of increase the amount of spill that you'll get though. So that's the proximity issue, which is relatively straightforward. But the next one, perhaps isn't so straightforward, which is the angle of the microphone over the drum. Generally speaking, the more acute the angle with the microphone diaphragm increasingly facing down at the batter head rather than across it, the more the overtones and the ring of a snare become accentuated, most notably between 1K and 10K. This is partly due to the res head and snare wires becoming more influential in the captured sound, but it's also due to the mic being more on axis to the batter head. So although this brightness can be valuable, the trade-off tends to be a less natural balance of overtones of the snare. Let's just have a quick listen to these different snare angles. These are snare hits with a Shure SM57 about an inch over the snare drum and with a very shallow angle of around sort of 20 degrees from the batter head. And then the same mic placement, but with the angle increased to 45 degrees. And you can hear the increased high frequency content there, the sort of overtones of the snare being emphasized, which is even more the case if we increase the angle of the SM57 to 70 degrees. And you can probably now hear that the snare's sounding quite unnatural, that the sort of control of the low frequency body of the drum is really being sort of overpowered by the overtones and the ring of the snare. One other approach that can be very effective, we've discussed the idea of starting roughly an inch into the snare drum and roughly an inch above, and then we've looked at changing the proximity of the snare microphone and we've looked at the angle of the microphone. But particularly with a drummer that plays a lot of rim shots, particularly with heavy hitting drummers, that microphone position might fail to capitalize on the bright harmonic content emanating from the rim of the drum. And it's often worth just trying to move the microphone further away from the center of the drum, so it's actually just off the rim of the drum, and that captures that high frequency content, that bright content, quite nicely. And another way of doing it is to aim the microphone across the drum to the far rim. So from your initial position, an inch over the drum, if you've got a very shallow microphone angle, if you're opting for that angle, is aim it at the far rim of the snare drum. Two different techniques there. One is going to lead to more spill. The other one is a very shallow, quite a controlled snare sound, but you aim the microphone at the far rim of the snare drum. It just subtly captures that high frequency content. Just before we move on to the snare bottom, one last thing to consider is double miking the snare top with a condenser mic as well as a dynamic. And a simple way of doing this is just, it captures more complexity of the source. And a simple way of doing this is just physically attaching a condenser microphone, for example, a Neumann KM184, and just attaching that to the dynamic mic, perhaps it's a Shure SM57, just with electrical tape, and that means that it can sit on the same stand as the dynamic microphone without needing another snare stand. If you are going down the route of a double mic technique for a snare top, Then an important consideration is phase alignment, so obviously phase being related to time of arrival differences. And in this instance, it's important to note that in many microphone designs, the diaphragm is not at the very tip of the housing, so you can't just align both of the microphone tips to be the same distance from the snare. And there is, there's software that will do this at the mix stage, for example, Sound Radix Auto Align, but it's better to do it at source. And there's a couple of different ways of doing it. One is just to get the microphones and adjust them while capturing, for example, a radio recording, and then just looking at the waveforms and adjusting the microphones till they're actually capturing that radio recording in this instance at the exact same time. Once you've worked out the distance, you can tape them together and put them on the mic stand from there. Let's move on to the snare bottom microphone. So the snare wires really can be considered as the tone generators for the brightness, the high frequency noise and the spit of a snare drum, which are essential components of a great snare sound. Some producers not big fans of snare bottom microphones and they won't use them in the mix, but there's some really lovely tricks with sending more of the snare bottom to reverb than the snare top that sometimes works beautifully with snare drums, and so that can be a valuable option to have at the mix stage. But microphone placement wise, to improve coherence when the signals are combined, try and keep the placement of the bottom microphone in a region directly under the top microphone. And generally try that should really mean, if you've set your snare top microphone up in the right region, that you've got the snare bottom mic aimed at the snare wires. And some people go for a similar distance from snare top to snare batter head to snare bottom to snare res head, but you can actually increase the distance. If it sounds boxy and boomy, certainly you can increase the distance. And there are some producers that experiment with a different angle, sort of like having the snare bottom microphone at around sort of like 45 degrees aimed at the center of the drum. So there's different options that you can try, but my advice is to really just make sure it's focused on very different qualities than the snare top, really getting that raspiness and spit from the snare wires, and that it's just not overly boomy and boxy from being excessively close, too much proximity effect. And of course, when recording a snare bottom, we need to reverse the polarity of that microphone to ensure that the polarity is coherent with the snare top microphone. So if you just think that when the batter head is struck, the batter moves away from the top microphone, and then the compression of air within the snare means that at the same time the res head moves towards the res head mic, and so a polarity reversal is needed to correct that. Moving onwards, just briefly, if you want the option of an additional snare signal for the mix stage, set up a microphone horizontally so it's aimed at the side of the snare, maybe from about 4 or 5 inches away. And despite the increased spill, this captures the collective tone of the top and bottom snare heads. And due to the mics being less proximate to both the snare top and snare bottom, it tends to capture less unwanted overtones than the closer mics. And a nice trick is to really treat it with radical compression, and it can sometimes add this really gritty texture. An alternative approach with that microphone is a dynamic mic halfway between the kick drum and the snare, obviously making sure that it isn't getting in the way of the drummer, but halfway between the kick drum and the snare, and then get that compressed really hard, and that adds a really nice sort of cohesive texture into the drums. Let's move on to the toms. So with suitable intervals between the toms, this comes back to drum tuning again, successfully capturing the tom shouldn't be anywhere near as challenging as capturing the kick and the snare. Dynamic microphones are typically the best choice, with those that don't have a low frequency roll off as significant as the Shure SM57 generally being more desirable. So the Sennheiser MD421 set to M, it's got a low frequency roll off between M and S, you want to set it to M. or a microphone such as the Audio Technica ATM 25 tends to be a good microphone choice. But because the toms don't have this, obviously we don't have rim shots with toms, we're not interested in capturing the rim, that you don't have that brightness and spit coming from the rim of a tom in the same way that you do with the rim of a snare drum. So generally you want to be, again, sort of roughly 1/2 inch to 1 inch over the head, and starting roughly 1/2 inch to 1 inch, depending on the size of the drum. And then similar considerations to what we discussed with the snare. In other words, proximity, balancing proximity with the angle. And again, the more acute the angle over the tom, you get more sort of brightness, but you can get an unbalance of those overtones. It can sound a little bit unnatural with an excessively acute tom angle here. In any instance though, make sure that the tom mics are between the lugs rather than next to them, and you get more pleasing overtones here. And direct the microphone at the center of the head to focus on stick attack is generally the best principle. And obviously when you get round to the larger toms, your larger floor toms, you can bring the microphone in by perhaps 2 inches rather than 1/2 inch to 1 inch, and same principle, aiming at the batter head contact point and then proximity and the angle of the microphone. Interestingly though, this is where you're really looking to balance up the stick attack and the weight of all your toms through adjustments. Really try and get, as the drummer goes around the toms, that you got a very similar stick attack, similar brightness and similar low frequency weight. And again, that might involve you retuning your drums. So another approach to capturing more body from your toms is additionally miking up the resonant heads, and particularly on the smaller toms, this can really bring a lot of life to toms. And the same as the principle with the snare bottom microphone, if you can keep the tom bottom mic placement directly below the tom top mic placement, you'll improve the coherence between the resulting signals. And of course, reverse the polarity of the tom bottom mic for the same reasons that we did so with the snare bottom mic. Then look at those adjustments again, whether it is low frequency, whether you're looking at reducing the proximity effect, and looking at perhaps whether the microphone is excessively boomy, and perhaps try an angle, an off-axis angle, sort of like beneath the bat head, so it's facing at the center of the drum. And as I mentioned earlier, don't have that resonant microphone in the center of the drum. Try and have it directly below where the top microphone is. One last thing with toms is concert toms, and concert toms pretty much mean removing the res head. And with tom shells that are less suited to a single-headed approach, your internal mic captures a sort of hollow characteristic, often equated to the sound of a basketball bounce and a bit closed in. But with drums that are well suited to this approach, you really can get quite a nice focused tom sound with vastly reduced spill, because you can internally mic the toms. So again, avoid the dead center of the drum, internally mic'd, starting maybe 4 or 5 inches away from the reverse side of the batter head, pointed at the batter head contact point, and you can get a really nice tom sound with greatly reduced spill. As with the kick drum, just one last thought: if you are removing the res heads from your toms, make sure that your lugs aren't rattling. You can pack them or tape them down using tape to just stop them rattling. If you've got them internally mic'd, those lugs rattling will find their way onto the recording. All right, let's move on to your metalwork. Let's move on to cymbals. This is without question one of the most underrated aspects of a great drum recording. The metalwork is where all the energy, all the subdivisions of all the beats are. And you listen to any of your great albums, and the way that the cymbals have been captured and processed and conveyed to the listener is really important. If you get the cymbal level too loud, it becomes abrasive. If the cymbal level is too quiet, you lack that energy. And so there really is that ideal zone, but that zone starts with capturing the cymbals really ideally in the first instance. Obviously, this is a bit of a challenge because perhaps with the exception of room microphones, which we will come on to, the metalwork mics are subject to the influence of room ambience more than any other microphone. And this can cause a little bit of a challenge, particularly in a less than ideal acoustic space. Acoustic environments with high ceilings are generally preferable as they enable the resulting ambient decay to be separated from the cymbal and shell transients themselves. This enables a sort of cleaner, less softened, more focused, sort of less coloured attack qualities to the cymbals and the shells. So for capturing a crisp and bright hat signal, the extended upper bandwidth of a condenser microphone is required. And this is broadly the case with all of the metalwork. Whereas we generally use often quite cheap dynamic microphones, you think about the Shure SM57, £70 microphone. With your metalwork microphones, price really often does equal quality, and if you are able to use really high standard, high quality, small diaphragm condensers such as the Neumann KM184, they're much easier to maneuver into position because they're small diaphragm and they provide a real great focus on your metalwork. So, you know, there's other designs like the AKG C451B, again, works really well. Placement-wise with the hats, you should aim for the best possible signal control enabled by maximum snare rejection combined with minimal proximity effect. But in real terms, you can't separate these two aspects. In other words, you get too close to the hi-hat and you're going to get great spill rejection, but you're also going to get proximity effect. And the further away, you're going to get reduced proximity effect, you're going to get that nicer sizzle of the hats, but you're going to get more of the snare spill. And that's the balance that you're seeking to capture. As a general guideline, a minimum distance of 4 inches above the hat is appropriate, aimed roughly on axis at the midway point between the edge of the bell and the edge of the hat at the furthest point away from the center of the snare. If the hats are struck too hard or the hats are quite heavy, you might need to increase this distance to resolve those sort of like thick, clunky sound qualities. But if you've got that whatever mic distance you've got and you've got a nice sizzly hat quality, you might want to try bringing them a little bit closer to the hats again, just to reduce that snare spill. So when you're turning the hats up and down, you're not turning the snare as much up and down as well. You've got more control. So let's just briefly listen to a hats microphone that is excessively close to the hats, and it's resulting in proximity effect in these sort of slightly clunky sounding hats. Let's have a listen. Although that might not be immediately apparent, if we just raise the distance of the microphone, you'll hear a much clearer, much more sizzly and pleasing hat sound. Moving on to the cymbals themselves, and we're going to be focusing on a space pair, which gives a very good stereo image, and then we'll be looking at paired cymbal miking and briefly individual cymbal miking. Your approach to a spaced pair really needs to be informed by how expansive your array of cymbals are. Let's firstly consider quite a wide array of cymbals here, where as much as possible your principal concern is going to be capturing each cymbal at equivalent level. The greater the width of the metalwork, the higher the space pair generally needs to be in order to prevent the mic's polar pattern compromising the capture of certain cymbals. And basically you just got to spend a lot of time listening to cymbal volumes being captured by the overhead microphones, getting your drummer to play abundant cymbal splashes and then just move the microphones around until you get an ideal placement to capture those cymbals. Look at the width at the same time. If the space pair is too narrow, too much of the right side of the cymbals are captured in the left side microphone and vice versa, which is going to result in a narrower stereo image. And of course, with your microphones excessively wide, you're not going to get the capture of the closer cymbals to the center of the kit. So again, a lot of experimentation is generally required, particularly with a drummer that's got quite a wide variety of cymbals being used. From here, you are likely to have specific challenges with chinas. Generally speaking, the chinas are incredibly loud, and if you can, try and keep those overhead microphones away from the china, and if you can, just have a separate microphone for the china. Might not be a realistic perspective, but if you've set up the microphone too close to that china, every time the china comes in, it's just going to absolutely dominate those cymbals, and it's going to cause you a lot of problems at the mix. More generally, try and keep the spaced pair of microphones the same distance from the snare drum, as this will help prevent a snare drum that pulls to one side during the mix. A lot of engineers that I've seen just use the simple tactic of getting a mic cable and just simply measuring it from the center of the snare drum to the tip of each of the space pair microphones. Other approaches include, you can position the metalwork microphones so that they're slightly shielded from seeing the snare. If you want less snare spill and more control, I'll give you an example. If you've got a very fast drum performance and because of the speed of the drum performance, they're not particularly heavy crashes, you want to really isolate those cymbal hits in the microphone, and so you might want to position the microphone so it can't actually see the snare drum. Is another technique that's worth considering. Another aspect worth thinking about with your cymbal microphones is with larger cymbals that can excessively move towards and away from the cymbal mic in a way that causes sort of swirly phasing artifacts. Just have a listen to this cymbal and you'll just hear the cymbal just sounds kind of choked, and you'll also hear these swirling phasey artifacts throughout the duration of the sound. And obviously the way to prevent that is just to move the microphone further away. Obviously with smaller splash cymbals, you're unlikely to suffer with this problem, but it's worth considering with your cymbal sounds, as it really can compromise the capture of your all-important metalwork. Next, if you've got the available microphones and mic pre's, potentially, particularly with an expansive cymbal setup, you can look at paired cymbal miking, which pretty much you've got a single microphone capturing two cymbals. And again, in this instance, similar considerations as before, but you're wanting to position the microphone above those cymbals and just moving it so it gets a balance of those two cymbals, so they're as evenly balanced as possible. And then of course you can go one step further and individually mic your cymbals. Some producers go as far as this. When doing so, if you're going to do that, all the same principles apply. You can obviously make sure that you've not got the swirling artifacts moving towards and away from the microphone, and you can look at the reduced snare spill and reduced tom spill by placing those condenser microphones so they can't see those kit components, in other words the toms and the snare. Last but not least, let's move on to room ambient mics. It's probably worth mentioning that in addition to drum samples, potentially being introduced, and gating and waveform edits, usually on your toms to remove or attenuate drum spill, these combined engineering and mixing approaches, particularly with these spot mics, they can result in the various drum components sounding sort of detached and disconnected from each other, sort of almost resembling the segregated sounds that you get from a drum machine. This is where room mics can prove absolutely invaluable. In this instance, a room microphone refers to a placement a minimum of 3 feet away from the drums, positioned around rather than above the kit. This captures a relatively balanced sort of ensemble image of the kit, almost like you've walked into the rehearsal room and you're listening to the drummer in that scenario. And obviously this captures the room's ambient character and the way that it colours the collective components of the drums. And with these with a good room microphone recording, this provides this controllable form of glue. It's like the radical alter ego to these gated or waveform edited spot mic'd drum components. This is a capture everything and captures the sound of the room. And again, as I say, this can be a really essential component of a great drum sound. In fact, some of the world's best recordings were with ambient microphones. You think of Led Zeppelin's When the Levee Breaks just being as one of the, well, I think it's often cited as the world's most emulated drum sound, and that was, as I'm sure you know, with ambient room mics actually hung in a stairway above the drum kit in this instance. Having said all that, the value of room ambient mics is largely dependent on the acoustics of your recording environment. And if you're recording in a studio where the acoustics are not that desirable, it's unlikely that you'll want to emphasize those characteristics at the mix stage, particularly so because one of the classic processing approaches of room mics is fast attack, fast release compression, which thereby attenuates the drum transients and lifts up the reverb, the ambience of the room, often creating what is referred to as hyperventilating drum sounds. It's this sort of breathing kind of impact from the drums, usually from the room mics. And if you want to listen to a classic example of this, listen to Motley Crue's self-titled album. There's a track on there called Till Death Do Us Part, and you'll hear these acoustic guitars and then the drums come in and you'll hear this really hyperventilating drum sound. Or Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood album is another example. So moving on to the room mics and your mic placement and mic choice. This should be partly focused on minimizing the capture of the metalwork. Some producers have them quite high in the room, and for me, particularly if I'm going to be compressing them quite hard, which I usually do, I prefer to keep them quite low, around knee height, and this sort of like reduces the cymbal wash that you get. So when you compress them, if you've got a lot of cymbal swell, the cymbals can become quite abrasive. So my personal approach is to keep them quite low to reduce that spill, around knee height. And then in this instance, you want to think about sort of whether you are using a figure of 8 microphone. So a Coles 4038 is a classic choice for room mic, a ribbon mic that got a nice dark quality. And you can use what's referred to as a Blumline pair, which is 2 figure of 8 microphones on top of each other. With the polar patterns, they're not aimed at the drums. So that's quite a valuable approach with room microphones. Alternative approaches are cardioid microphone facing at the drum kit, or even cardioid microphone facing away from the drums. Some producers even go so far as putting up gobos, baffles in front of the drums, and then capturing a microphone that's facing away from the baffles at the rear wall, and it really separates the drums from the ambience. And obviously, the greater the microphone distance to source, the greater level of ambience captured. And in this instance, you just want to think about, other approaches are with an omni microphone, which obviously means that we've got sound from 360 degrees around the microphone being captured. So it captures that ambience as well as the drum kit, alternatively figure of 8, or as I say, cardioid, either faced at the drums or usually away from the drums. Which brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening to this Sound on Sound recording and mixing podcast. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for the next episode focused on the bass guitar.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Oh, and just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcasts website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels.